Imagine yourself in a dim, narrow hall where the faint flicker of candlelight dances across pale faces gathered around a long wooden table. At its center sits a corpse dressed in its finest garments, positioned as the guest of honor. Glassy eyes seem to follow the attendees as they raise their cups in a toast to the dead. The air is heavy with the scent of wax and decaying flesh, yet no one dares to object. This is no tale of horror fiction, but a real funerary ritual practiced in the dark villages of the Middle Ages. The sounds of chewing mingled with the wails of mourners, while wine was poured onto the ground as an offering to hungry spirits. In the corner, a plate reserved for the deceased was filled and then emptied in silence, for everyone knew the spirit had claimed its share. Any sudden movement of the corpse, perhaps caused by a cold draft, was interpreted as a sign of approval or displeasure from the other world. And displeasure was feared far more than death itself. In those days, the dead did not depart easily. You had to feed them, appease them, and convince them not to return for a midnight visit. Otherwise, on a moonlit night, you might hear the clatter of their bones at your cottage door, demanding their final meal. Welcome to this captivating historical episode, delving into life in the Middle Ages. If you're seeking a serene yet stimulating historical tale to transport you to a dreamlike world, you've found the perfect place. Before we embark on our journey through time, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. If you enjoy this kind of relaxing, educational content, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any episodes. These peculiar funerary practices had deep roots in the fertile soil of pre-medieval superstitions and myths, where ancient pagan beliefs intertwined with existential dread of death and the soul. In those shadowy times, before the church fully dominated death rituals, simple peasants lived in a world haunted by spirits and goblins at every turn. In ancient Gaulish villages, where towering trees were considered abodes of gods, the dead were treated as family members who had not yet left. Deceased ancestors were seated in their favorite chairs, fed and spoken to as if still among the living. This was not mere custom, but an existential necessity. Neglected or hungry dead might return to wreak vengeance on the living. During harsh winters, when northern winds howled through wooden huts, peasants left bowls of milk and honey at their doorsteps, not for stray animals, but for ancestral spirits who might visit on the coldest nights. In some remote villages, pieces of bread were placed in the mouths of the dead before burial, as provisions for their long journey to the underworld. Early Christian monks, arriving in these remote regions, were shocked by what they saw. A 6th century manuscript recounts a Christian priest's discovery of an entire village celebrating a 7-day funerary feast, complete with dancing and wine drinking around a corpse adorned daily with wildflowers. The clergy tried to suppress these practices, but they persisted in secret for centuries under the guise of Christianity. In the pitch-black early Middle Ages, when the boundary between life and death was hazy, it was not uncommon for peasants to dream of the dead demanding food or warmth. These visions prompted many to leave the deceased's favorite dishes on gravestones, or hostful feasts on death anniversaries. Some families, clinging to ancient traditions, kept an ancestor's skull in their home, offering it food on special occasions. Remarkably, these practices were not limited to common folk. Even among nobles, it was customary to place food and drink in graves. In a Frankish tomb near Paris, archaeologists found an entire chicken skeleton and ceramic vessels with wine residues, a final meal for a companion journeying to the other world. As centuries passed and the church tightened its grip on daily life, these rituals faded from public view, but never fully vanished. They transformed into clandestine practices or were cloaked in Christian rites. What was once a raucous feast around a corpse became a solemn mass for eternal rest. Yet, in remote villages, fear of the hungry dead lingered in hearts, passed down through chilling evening tales. Beneath the faint glow of moonlight, where bare tree branches sway like pale fingers whispering secrets of the dead, medieval cemeteries transformed into stages for eerie rituals during long winter nights. Here, on damp soil concealing ancestral bones, practices persisted despite the passage of centuries. Black candles stood atop weathered gravestones, their heavy incense filling the air, as if forming a temporary bridge between the living and the dead. In some isolated villages, where darkness still gripped minds, strange whispers echoed from cracks in ancient tombs. Elderly women in black garments moved between stone rows, placing cups of fresh milk and moldy bread on gravestones. Their trembling hands traced cryptic signs in the air, muttering words in an archaic dialect no one fully understood. The milk slowly seeped into the earth, as if the thirsty ground drank it to quench the unrested spirit's thirst. When a villager fell ill with a mysterious ailment or crops failed without cause, locals gathered at graves at midnight. They dug a small pit at the tomb's head, burying a straw doll shaped like a human, adorned with a lock of the sick person's hair or a handful of barren soil. Then they circled the grave, step forward, 2 steps back in a halting dance reminiscent of lost souls wandering to the other world. Their voices rose, blending pleas with threats, as if negotiating with an unforgiving hidden force. On certain nights, when the veil between worlds was believed to thin dangerously, full feasts were laid atop graves. Plates of cold meat, salted bread, and dried fruit were carefully arranged on wooden boards placed directly on tombstones. Cups brimmed with dark red wine were slowly poured onto the ground, vanishing into the grass as if slaking an unquenchable thirst. No one dared touch the food after its offering. Those who ate the dead's meal might join them. In regions clinging to remnants of ancient pagan beliefs, even stranger practices emerged. Chicken blood was poured into trenches dug around graves, forming a red circle to trap evil within. Heads of slaughtered animals hung on stakes, their glassy eyes staring into the void as if seeing what the living could not. By morning, these offerings vanished without a trace, as if the earth itself had swallowed them silently. In the darkest nights, when even animals hid in their burrows, shadowy human figures sometimes drifted among graves. They did not walk, but floated slowly, moving from tomb to tomb as if searching. Occasionally, strange chewing sounds or the pouring of liquid into an unseen cup were heard. By morning, guards sometimes found cold footprints in the mud leading to a specific grave, then stopping abruptly, as if their owner had vanished mid-step. These rituals, though bizarre, were not empty gestures. They were desperate attempts by the living to control their greatest fear, that death was merely the start of eternal suffering, and that hungry or thirsty spirits could return if not sufficiently appeased. Every piece of bread, every cup of wine, every tear shed on the soil was a tax paid by the living for temporary peace from the horrors of the afterlife. In neglected cemetery corners, visited only during these occasions, remnants of darker rituals lingered. Broken bird bones arranged in strange geometric shapes, candles made from unconventional animal fat, and clotted blood on ancient gravestones. traces of secretive practices by those who believed they could not only appease but summon and command the dead. The wind howls through gravestones, carrying echoes of the past. A woman's sobs, children's laughter long silenced, a man's dying groan from centuries ago. These sounds blend with those of the living who still come, bearing fear, hope, and simple offerings. In this place, where past and present blur, the boundary between worlds grows ever hazier. Deep in the night, when silence reigns, the sound of a shovel striking earth sometimes rings out. Not from a worker at that late hour, but from beneath the ground, as if someone is trying to escape. Beneath a land slumbering under layers of time and soil, where silence speaks in the language of worn stones, the earth hides countless secrets about the enigmatic customs our ancestors practiced over their dead. They left us mute archaeological traces, each stone bearing a story waiting to be uncovered. In medieval cemeteries scattered around abandoned monasteries in the French countryside, excavators found broken bird bones buried beside the skeletons, their heads severed and arranged in concentric circles. Not meal remnants, but carefully placed blood offerings, perhaps a map guiding spirits to their new realm. Among decayed ribs, charred wheat and barley grains were found, deliberately burned before burial, possibly to reach the other world whose path none knew. In the Saint-Marthe Cemetery near Toulouse, archaeologist Pierre Lemoine uncovered something odd in 2008. Dozens of 9th century graves containing small clay jars buried at the skeleton's feet. These jars held decayed organic matter, but chemical analysis revealed traces of honey and milk. Strangely, their openings were sealed with ancient coins, as if payment for a mythical ferryman to carry the soul across an underworld river. Beneath the floor of Notre-Dame de la Mer Church in Provence, where masses for the dead were held, a peculiar layer of ash and charcoal was found 2 meters deep, not from a fire, but from hearths built within the cemetery itself. Among the ash, fully incinerated animal bones, especially roosters and dogs, were arranged in shapes resembling ancient pagan symbols. It seems Christian priests knew of these practices, but chose to baptize them as acceptable purification rituals rather than oppose them. At the Mont de Marseille archaeological site, where a lost 12th century village once stood, excavations revealed 2 parallel rows of graves, separated by a narrow path strewn with deliberately shattered pottery. Analysis showed these vessels once held alcoholic beverages, likely local berry and honey wines. The living apparently drank over their dead, then smashed the cups to prevent reuse or to accompany the deceased on their journey. In the crypts of Roquetaillade Castle in the Pyrenees, where nobles buried their dead in private vaults, graves bore strange carvings, not typical epitaphs, but images of human hands holding cups or plates, inscribed with vulgar Latin phrases like "take and drink" or "this is yours alone." Some carvings showed knife marks, as if someone later tried to erase them. Most chilling were graves containing, alongside human skeletons, skulls of small animals, squirrels, cats, birds, placed between hand bones, as if the deceased held them as gifts for otherworldly visitors. In the Fontaine aux Roses site near the German border, a mass grave from Black Death victims revealed even stranger rites. Skeletons were wrapped in colored cloth stained with alkaline substances, possibly to prevent evil spirits from escaping. Beneath each skull lay a handful of salt and dried garlic, with at least 1 iron pin, perhaps to secure a magical shroud. Oddly, some bodies were buried seated on wooden chairs rather than lying flat, as if prepared to join a post-burial feast. In Brittany's mythical Brocéliande forest, steeped in tales of magic and the dead, a strange stone circle was found, its center holding a pit filled with mixed human and animal bones and burnt pottery. Radiocarbon dating showed the bones spanned centuries, suggesting this was a renewed ritual site, revisited generation after generation for the same funerary practices over their ancestors' remains. In Paris's Cluny Museum, behind shatterproof glass, lies a rare collection of dreams of the dead, amulets and artifacts found in graves. Among them is a small silver dish inscribed in Latin, "Whenever you eat from this, remember me." The dish bears deep knife marks, as if food was cut on it before burial. Beside it, a necklace of tiny bones, each carved with a name, as if inviting the dead to a feast. These findings paint a vivid picture of a medieval world where death was not an end but a precarious transition, requiring elaborate rituals to ensure the dead's peace and the living's safety. The interplay of pagan and Christian beliefs created a rich, eerie tapestry of practices that lingered in the shadows, defying time and dogma, whispering of a time when the dead were as present as the living. In the darkness of old homes with thick walls, where moonlight barely sneaks through dirty window glass, daily life was filled with strange customs that tied the living to the dead in a way that couldn't be broken. In the shadowy corners of the kitchen, where simple clay pots piled up, there was always a special jar no one touched except at certain times. This jar held leftover food for the dead, bits of meals left on plates on purpose, carefully collected and placed in this sacred jar. Once a month, when the moon was at its darkest, the woman of the house took these scraps and buried them by the front door, in a ritual just like the offerings left on graves, as if the doorstep was a tiny tomb for ancestors who could no longer enter the home. In low-ceiling bedrooms, where dried herb bundles hung from wooden beams, families did bedtime rituals that connected directly to the funeral practices at graves. The woman would dip her finger in olive oil and draw signs on everyone's forehead, just like priests anointed the dead with holy oils before burial. Under pillows, they placed olive branches and handfuls of salt, the same way these were tucked into the shrouds of the dead. This wasn't just chance. It was a strong belief that sleep was a temporary death, and the soul left the body at night like it did in final death, making sleepers open to the same dangers as the dead in their graves. In the dark corners of the home, where shadows gathered like living things, small black cloth bags hung, filled with a secret mix of herbs and ground bones. These bags were protective charms, like the offerings left on graves to please spirits. Every evening, the woman of the house whispered to these bags and placed small pieces of salted bread beside them, just like visitors left food on gravestones. These home rituals were a smaller version of those done in cemeteries, as if every house had its own tiny graveyard. On long winter nights, when storms howled around the house, families gathered by the fireplace and held what was like a small feast for the dead. They left an empty chair at the table with a plate and cup filled, just like they did in cemeteries during big feasts of the dead. The empty chair was for the ancestors' spirits who might visit on stormy nights. After eating, they left food scraps on the table until morning, the same way they left food on graves at night. In corners of the home rarely cleaned, a layer of dust was left on purpose, believed to hold the traces of ancestors visiting at night. These corners could only be swept on certain days of the year, like the days when graves were cleaned and offerings renewed. Even the cleaning was like grave rituals, done with a brush of oak branches and salty water. In the dark attic, where old things were stored, families kept a special box with ancestors' belongings: an old shirt, a broken comb, a child's tiny shoe. These items were brought out on special occasions and placed in the living room, just like personal offerings were placed on graves during festivals of the dead. They believed these objects acted as a bridge between the living and the dead, like items buried with the dead for their use in the other world. In the backyard's shadowy corners, where sunlight rarely reached, special plants were grown: barren mint, black thyme, roses that never bloomed. These plants were sacred because they fed on the memory of the dead. They were watered with the water used to wash corpses, just like graves were sprinkled with this water. On moonlit nights, women collected leaves from these plants and placed them under pillows, believing they'd bring dreams from the other world. At the thresholds of inner doors, small animal bones were buried in secret rituals. These bones were placed facing a certain way, usually toward the nearest family graveyard. This ritual was thought to stop evil spirits from entering the home, just like bones were placed around graves to keep spirits from leaving. Each bone was like a tiny guard, similar to the stone statues on gravestones. In the damp cellar, where mold and mushrooms grew, wine jars were left open on purpose to let the contents spoil. This spoiled wine was used in special rituals, poured in the four corners of the house, just like bad wine was poured around graves in rituals to please the dead. They believed the soul was like wine. Both changed with time, but never truly died. In the dark nights before a burial, when the only sound was the rustle of burning candles with their flickering flames, the living sat for hours by their dead, in a scene mixing sadness with fear. These vigils weren't just a social custom, but a necessary ritual to protect both the dead and the living. In the room's dark corners, where shadows danced on the walls, night watchers took turns sitting by the body, staring at the pale face slowly changing under death's touch. Every small movement of the body, a slight bulge in the belly, a faint sound like a moan, even a fly landing on the forehead, was seen as a sign from the other world. Old women sat near the dead person's head, chanting soft hymns while wiping their cold hands with cloth soaked in vinegar and salty water. This sharp smell filling the room wasn't just to hide the first signs of rot, but also to chase away evil spirits that might try to steal the body before the rituals were done. In the room's four corners, small silver dishes held salt and mustard, arranged the same way they would be at burial. Salt was a barrier against evil spirits, while mustard, with its symbolic heat, gave the dead warmth for their cold journey to the other world. At midnight, when the vigil reached its peak, a family member offered the body its last meal. This wasn't just symbolic. They forced open the corpse's mouth and placed small bits of bread soaked in wine, like feeding a sick child. In some places, this was done 3 times, with a special chant each time. They believed the soul stayed near the body for days and needed food like the living. After the meal, they tied the corpse's jaw with a white cloth, not just to keep it shut, but to stop the soul from speaking if it tried to return to the body. In the early morning hours, as faint light crept through the windows, they held the final farewell ritual. Each family member came forward to wipe the dead person's forehead with a cloth soaked in special water left under moonlight for a whole night. This cloth would later be buried with the body to remind it of its loved ones in the other world. During this ritual, the old women closely watched for any change in the corpse's face. A slight smile, a wrinkle on the brow, even a tiny shift in skin color. All these were seen as messages from the other world, showing the dead person's approval or anger toward the living. On especially cold nights, when frost coated the windows, they lit a small fire in the hearth, even if no one needed warmth. This fire had to burn through the whole vigil, not just to keep evil spirits away, but to give the dead a light for their dark journey. Sometimes they threw bits of the dead person's hair and nails into the fire, believing it helped the soul fully leave the body. The smoke from these fires was thought to carry part of the soul to the heavens. In the final moments before taking the body to the graveyard, they did the closing of the paths ritual. They passed a lit candle over and under the coffin 3 times, chanting an old spell to stop the soul from returning home alone. Then they sprinkled drops of holy water, or salty water in non-Christian areas, in the room's 4 corners, like closing doors opened by death. Finally, when carrying the coffin out, it had to pass over a small fire at the doorstep, a last ritual to ensure the soul couldn't follow the living back home. Digging in different parts of Europe has uncovered amazing proof of these death rituals inside homes during the Middle Ages. In a French village called Saint-Pierre-le-Vif from the 13th century, diggers found homes with special death rooms, isolated corners set aside for bodies before burial. One of these rooms had a low stone platform exactly the size of a human body, with small channels carved to drain body fluids, showing bodies were kept there for days. Even more striking, they found small hollows under these platforms holding animal bones, broken clay pieces, and charred food scraps, clear offerings for the dead. In a noble's home from the 14th century in Normandy, archaeologists found a secret room behind the main fireplace. Its inner walls were covered with odd carvings, human hands holding plates and cups, with Latin writings saying, "Take and drink." In the room's center was a round stone table with knife marks and dark stains that tests showed were mixed human and animal blood. Most importantly, they found dozens of small coins buried under the room's threshold, a known pagan burial practice as payment for the ferrymen of the dead. It seems this room was used for secret feasts of the dead inside the house itself. In the Alsace region on the French-German border, a group of 12th century homes had strange building features. The stone doorsteps of main entrances were carved with maze-like designs, a symbol in European folklore for confusing spirits. Right under these doorsteps, diggers found human finger bones, usually pinkies, buried in circular patterns. Old writings mention this was a way to stop evil spirits from entering the home after the body left. In a cellar of an old merchant's house in Rouen, they found a shocking set of death jars, clay pots marked to show they were used in home funeral rituals. Some of these jars held layers of ash, dirt, and tiny bones, suggesting they were used over generations. Most interesting, the jar openings were sealed with pieces of old shroud cloth, with local dialect writings saying, "Here lies my shadow." In Brittany's coastal area, where pagan traditions lasted late, village homes had deathbeds, fixed wooden structures built in main bedrooms. These beds were shorter than usual and raised off the ground, with drainage holes at the base. Microscopic tests found traces of poisonous plants like belladonna and hemlock in the wood cracks, hinting at their use in temporary embalming. Families kept their dead on these beds for weeks, sometimes before burial, as confirmed by church records complaining about this practice. In the Auvergne mountain region, 11th century homes had memory walls, wooden panels carved behind the fireplace. These panels had names of the family's dead, with dates and small details about their lives. Most importantly, they found small carved spaces in the floor in front of each panel, holding ash and burned bones, showing regular memory offering burnings inside the home itself. In the Pyrenees, diggings uncovered homes with death doors, small entrances separate from main doors, no taller than a meter. These doors were opened only when carrying out a body, then sealed forever with mortar mixed with bone ash. The belief was these doors let the soul leave the home without being able to return the same way. In noble castles in southern France, they found waiting halls for funerals, fancy rooms decorated with wall paintings of pagan myths about the underworld. The floors sloped slightly toward a central drain, where they found remains of dried plants used in embalming, like myrrh and frankincense. Historical records say nobles kept their dead in these rooms for months sometimes, holding weekly feasts beside the body. In small monasteries around Paris, they found dedication rooms for monks. These rooms had stone basins for funeral washing, with drains leading straight to herb gardens. Wall carvings show monks did living dead rituals, sitting with the body at night and reading to it as if it were alive. Accompanying writings say these rituals sometimes lasted 40 nights and days. The fear of the dead returning controlled people's minds. This wasn't just a story told around the fire at night, but a deep, real terror rooted in daily life. People saw with their own eyes how bodies swelled and changed after death, how bad smells came from them, and how they rotted in strange ways. These changes, which they didn't understand scientifically, were seen as signs that something still lived inside the body, or that the soul hadn't fully left yet. They believed the human soul wasn't one thing but many parts. Some went to heaven or hell, while others stayed tied to the earth. This earthly part was thought to return to the body after burial, especially if funeral rituals weren't done right. In far-off villages, where pagan burial traditions were still strong, people believed a dead person might come back if not satisfied with offerings and rituals. Countless stories told of bodies found outside their graves days after burial, with long nails and growing hair, as if still alive underground. The Black Death, which killed millions in the 14th century, made this fear even worse, turning it into an obsession. When death took whole families in days, and bodies were thrown into mass graves without proper rituals, terrifying stories spread about night walkers, dead who returned from graves to spread disease among the living. In some areas, they tied the dead's feet together with ropes or placed heavy stones on their chests before burial to stop them from rising again. Diseases, wars, and famines made death a familiar guest in every home, creating a deep need to cope with its terror. Rituals for connecting with the dead, though strange to modern eyes, were a way for people to live with the idea of daily death without losing their minds. Despite this, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages fought hard against these pagan practices tied to the dead, seeing them as a serious challenge to its beliefs and spiritual authority. This quiet battle began when Christianity came to Europe, but it grew stronger after the 10th century, when the Central Church in Rome started controlling religious practices in far-off areas more strictly. In local church councils held across France between the 9th and 12th centuries, decisions were made to ban feasts with the dead and feeding ancestors, calling these customs pagan leftovers that needed to be stopped. Bishops issued warnings threatening to excommunicate anyone who did or joined these rituals. At the Synod of Toulouse in 1056, a clear rule was made to stop burying food with the dead, or placing it on graves, saying it insulted the Christian belief in resurrection. Christian missionaries sent to remote rural areas had strict orders to fight these customs. Their reports to bishops are full of details about their methods, from smashing the clay pots used for the dead in village squares to forcing villagers to attend masses for resting souls on dates of old pagan festivals. Some reports mention how priests baptized children with saints' names on specific dates to shift focus from ancestor rituals. By the 13th century, with the start of the Inquisition, this fight turned harsher. The Inquisition didn't just target heretics, but also those practicing worship of the dead, as they called it. Records from Toulouse and Carcassonne courts show dozens of cases where people were executed or jailed just for placing food on a grave or talking to the dead, as witnesses claimed. One favorite tactic of inquisitors was setting traps at night in cemeteries during old pagan holidays to catch people in the act. But the Church didn't rely only on punishment. It created Christian ritual alternatives. The idea of purgatory, developed in the 12th century, was part of this plan, offering a Christian explanation for where souls go before heaven and tying their salvation to prayers and masses instead of food and physical offerings. Holidays like All Souls' Day, November 2nd, were promoted as a Christian substitute for pagan death festivals. The Church encouraged lighting candles and praying for the dead instead of feeding them, stressing that prayers helped souls more than any physical food. New monastic groups like the Dominicans and Franciscans played a big role in this cultural battle. Their monks traveled through rural areas preaching against death superstitions and offering alternatives like rosary prayers at graves. Dominican records in Provence detail conversion strategies, like setting up large crosses at old pagan burial sites or baptizing trees and graves considered sacred by locals. Church writings from that time were another weapon in this fight. Miracle stories about saints exaggerated their victories over evil dead spirits, while sermons about hell focused on punishing those who tried contacting the dead. Some bishops, like Jacques de Vitry in the 13th century, encouraged writing horror stories about returning dead as warnings to believers. Despite all these efforts, records show the Church didn't fully succeed in wiping out these beliefs. Reports from bishops' visits up to the 15th century keep mentioning pagan leftovers in burial and memorial practices. Some local priests, especially in remote areas, ignored these practices or even joined them secretly, believing they helped keep simple villagers faithful. In the end, the Church had to make a kind of compromise. Many old rituals were baptized and given Christian meanings. Food offered to the dead became charity for the poor in the dead's name, and water poured on graves became holy water. But in secret, especially among women and elders in villages, many old practices continued into modern times, hidden under a thin Christian cover. The Catholic Church cleverly absorbed many old pagan practices about the dead into its beliefs, leading to customs that looked Christian but carried traces of those ancient beliefs. One clear example is All Saints' Day, November 1st, a clear Christian version of the pagan festival for remembering the dead. In France, the old village tradition of lighting candles on graves and making special bread of the dead still exists today, though now under a Christian cover. These candles, once meant to guide returning spirits to the underworld, now represent Christ's light, shining the way for souls in purgatory. The ritual of honoring saints' relics that spread in the Middle Ages also shows clear traces of these old practices. kissing holy bones, placing them in decorated boxes, or carrying them in official processions strongly recalls pagan rituals for connecting with the dead. The Church made this a legitimate worship by focusing on these relics belonging to saints who could pray to God. But the pagan roots are clear in the focus on the dead's physical body and its supposed magical power. Even today, in many French churches, you can see believers touching saints' coffins or rubbing personal items on them for blessings. The Eternal Rest Prayer, Requiem Aeternam, repeated in funeral masses, also carries traces of those old beliefs. Its focus on the dead needing rest, peace, and light reflects ancient fears that souls might be restless or stuck between worlds. The Church turned this worry into a theological idea about purgatory, but the emotional need behind these prayers remains similar to what drove ancestors to feed their dead and light their way. The Honoring the Dead ritual on November 2nd, right after All Saints' Day, is another striking example of this shift. On this day, French people visited graves and left food on them, just like their pagan ancestors did. The Church turned this into a day of prayer for all departed faithful, but the folk practices stayed very similar. In Brittany, for example, some villagers still leave a special cake called Bread of the Dead, pain de mort, on gravestones, though they now call it charity rather than food for the dead. Many religious charms and jewelry also carry traces of these beliefs. Small crosses worn around necks, sometimes holding a piece of the true cross, are like the old pagan charms that protected against harm from evil spirits. The Church blessed these practices by tying them to the power of the cross, but their core purpose remained the same: protection from the hidden powers of the dead. The holy water ritual used in the Catholic Church also has roots in those old beliefs. In many French areas, people sprinkled water on graves or around homes to chase away evil spirits. The Church turned this into blessed water, used in religious rituals, but its folk use stayed much the same. Even today, you can see some elderly people in rural France sprinkling holy water around their homes during big religious holidays, the same way their ancestors did centuries ago. Many Christian saints linked to the dead carry clear traits of pre-Christian gods and spirits. Saint Michael, seen as the leader of heavenly armies and fighter of demons, has many traits of pagan gods who protected against harm from the dead. Saint Anthony the Great, called upon for protection from plague and evil spirits, takes the place of ancient guardian spirits that protected villages from harm. Even the Catholic idea of purgatory, fully developed in the Middle Ages, carries traces of those old beliefs. The idea that souls need a cleansing period before entering heaven, and that the living can help through prayers and charity, recalls pagan beliefs about stuck souls needing help from the living to move to the other world. The Church gave this a Christian theological frame, but the emotional and cultural roots remain strikingly similar. In nobles' castles and great halls, where power and wealth mixed with superstition and fear, practices for connecting with the dead took on lavish and strange forms, fitting their high status. Nobles were no less afraid of the dead returning than common people, maybe even more, as their ancient lineages and political ambitions made them eager to ensure their ancestors' approval. In Château de Brissac, in Poitou, records from the 14th century describe how Duke Arnoul VI held an annual feast in the Great Hall for his father's death anniversary, setting an empty chair at the table's head with a plate and a pure gold cup for the dead. Servants filled the cup with fine wine and changed the plate regularly, as if the dead would eat. The Duke even insisted the hall's window stay open all night to let his father's spirit enter. In the noble de Montmorency family, there was a strange tradition of dressing a wax statue of the dead in their finest clothes and placing it on a chair in the throne room for the first month after death. This statue was treated like a living person. Given food and drink morning and evening, its clothes changed daily, and even taken to the castle's chapel for Mass. Family records say this ritual continued until the real body began to rot in the grave, only then believing the soul had fully left. In Burgundy, dukes developed a complex system for talking to the dead. They kept a special record called the Black Book, where they wrote dreams featuring departed ancestors, then showed these to the family monk for interpretation. Some surviving records show how major political and military decisions were made based on these messages from the other world. In 1378, for example, Duke Philip the Bold wrote how his dead father appeared in a dream, warning him against allying with the English, leading him to completely change his foreign policy. The de Laval family in Brittany was known for nights of watching, where the heir spent the night alone with ancestors' skulls before being crowned. In the morning, he told the priest any dreams or visions, and only if they were favorable was he officially crowned. This practice continued until the 16th century, when the church replaced real skulls with silver ancestor statues. In the famous Château de Hautefort near Paris, Countess Isabelle de Bavière, later Queen of France, held strange living dead parties. For her ancestors' death anniversaries, she invited poor people who looked like the dead, dressed them in their clothes, and fed them at lavish tables, while she and noble guests watched in silence. Records say these parties lasted until midnight, when a priest read a special prayer to send the souls back to their place. In southern France, where Catholic noble families lived alongside Cathar culture, even stranger practices developed. The famous de Foix family kept an ancestors' room in their castle, where they hung the dead's armor and weapons on walls with plaques listing their birth and death dates. Every Friday night, the family head entered the room, touched each piece of armor, and whispered family secrets and wishes, believing the ancestors' spirits heard and responded. This custom continued secretly even after the church banned it in the 15th century. In Normandy, the de Harcourt family's nobles were known for annual dead processions. On the anniversary, they carried a wooden statue of the dead, usually a family founder, dressed in fine clothes through their villages. Peasants came out to greet the dead lord and offer gifts as if he were alive, while nobles gave out charity in his name. This strange practice was an effective way to remind peasants of the ruling family's power even after its members' deaths. In the papal palace in Avignon during the 14th century, cardinals and princes held lavish memorial feasts. These weren't just simple masses, but grand events with hundreds of guests, where ancestors' portraits were placed on the table with special candles. Pope Clement VI himself was known for hosting such feasts to honor past popes. Papal records note these events cost huge sums, with rare foods and complex setups to honor the dead like the living. In the de Albert family, there was a strong belief that a dead person's soul stayed in the castle for 40 days after death. During this time, servants prepared a special room for the dead each night, making the bed, filling the bathtub, and setting out clean clothes. In the morning, they checked for signs the soul used these things. One maid wrote in her diary how she once found a pillow dented as if someone had slept on it, seen as clear proof of the soul's presence. In the famous Château de Chinon, where the French royal family lived for centuries, there was a strange tradition for royal burials. After death, they made a wax statue of the dead in coronation clothes and sat it on the throne in the great hall for 40 days. During this time, nobles and ministers came to consult the statue on important matters, believing the king's soul still ruled until the body was buried. This peaked with King Charles VI, where the statue's rule lasted 3 full months due to succession disputes. In Brittany, where pagan traditions were especially strong, the de Rohan family's nobles developed a complex system of dead trials. When the family head died, they held a council of nobles and relatives to judge the dead for their life's actions. This wasn't just a review, but a real ritual with charges, defense, and a verdict. If the dead was found guilty of certain sins, they added chains to the coffin or placed specific symbols on the gravestone to bind the soul. This odd practice continued until the 16th century, when the church officially banned it. In the palaces of Italian nobles ruling parts of southern France, luxury mourning practices reached exaggerated levels. The Vespucci family in Marseille was famous for golden funerals, covering the dead's body in gold leaf and displaying it in the reception hall for a full week, visited by relatives and friends to say goodbye. Servants ensured fresh flowers were changed daily around the body and burned the finest incense to mask the smell of decay. These lavish practices showed wealth and power as much as they expressed grief. In the de Lusignan family, which ruled large parts of western France, they believed ancestors' spirits protected the castle from enemies. So, they kept busts of all their ancestors in the castle's chapel and held a special monthly mass before them. During dangers like sieges or military threats, they took these busts and placed them on the walls as symbolic guards. Soldiers believed seeing these busts boosted their morale and scared enemies. In the de Bourbon Palace, which later gave rise to France's royal line, there was a secret room called the Ancestors' Room, where they kept necklaces with locks of hair from all their great ancestors. For any major decision, the family head entered this room, touched each necklace, and whispered the request or question. The belief was that the ancestors' wisdom would guide them to the right choice. This room remained a closely guarded family secret for centuries, only discovered by historians in the 19th century. In the royal palace of Fontainebleau, there was a strange tradition for a king's death. After the death was announced, servants gathered all the king's personal clothes and daily items and placed them in a special room for a full year. During this time, the king's personal servant entered daily to clean and prepare the items as if the king would use them. Only after the year passed did they donate these items to the church or give them to the poor. This ritual was seen as necessary for a smooth transition of the king's soul to the other world. Even in modern times, despite huge societal changes and shifting customs, some practices from centuries ago remain in some form, though their meanings and methods have changed. Among these are rituals tied to feeding the dead. Today, while supernatural beliefs about this are gone, similar behaviors persist among the elite, though in more symbolic and elegant forms. In the past, nobles' tables sometimes had plates and cups set for the dead, especially during religious holidays or family events, as a way to connect generations and honor ancestors' memories. Today, this tradition has become more refined, like hosting lavish feasts on the anniversary of a loved one's death, serving their favorite dishes, or placing an empty seat of honor at the table's head to symbolize their spiritual presence. These practices, though free of supernatural beliefs, carry the same feeling of connecting with the past and celebrating memories, a mark of sophistication in dealing with loss. Likewise, giving food to the poor or donating lavish feasts during religious or personal occasions traces back to those old beliefs, where feeding the needy was thought to please spirits or gain blessings. Today, this act has become a sign of social generosity that the wealthy and influential value, not out of fear of spirits, but as an expression of social responsibility and a desire to leave a positive mark. Holding charity feasts or funding food banks to honor the memory of loved ones has become an elegant custom reflecting deep social awareness, an extension of those ancient rituals, though the motives and methods have changed. Also, keeping valuable family heirlooms like silver spoons or rare cups and using them only for special occasions reflects the idea of staying connected to the past. In the Middle Ages, a dead person's belongings were seen as holding part of their soul, and using them was a way to include them in the event. Today, using these fine items in grand feasts is just a way to honor family traditions and pride in roots, a distinctive mark of elite classes who value their history and heritage. Thus, many customs once tied to death rituals have turned into refined social practices, free of superstition but keeping that deep symbolic meaning that marks elite behavior. Modern nobles, though they've left behind many old beliefs, have kept the core of these traditions, adding touches of modernity and fine taste, making these practices part of their unique identity. Mocking practices tied to feeding the dead, even if we see them as mere superstitions from a religious or rational view, opens a deep philosophical question about the nature of human meaning and respect for the diversity of symbols in human existence. Life isn't just a chain of physical facts that can be reduced to scientific truths or strict religious beliefs. It's also a complex web of symbols and rituals that give existence flavor and purpose. When we mock others' rituals, even if they seem illogical to us, we don't just belittle their beliefs. We somehow deny a core part of humanity that longs to create meaning beyond physical facts. Since the dawn of history, humans haven't lived on bread alone, but also on stories and symbols that give death meaning and make loss bearable. Rituals of feeding the dead, whether tables set before graves or dishes left at night as a kind of spiritual charity, aren't just odd acts. They're attempts to fill the existential void left by the absence of loved ones. They're much like the flower someone places on a stranger's grave in a public cemetery, not because they knew them, but because they know death is a shared fate, and beauty and memory are humanity's only response to the horror of being forgotten. Then there's the issue of ethics tied to respect. Even if we believe these practices have no basis in physical or religious reality, mocking them means failing to recognize the legitimacy of the human pain that created them. Someone who mocks a widow leaving a plate of food for her dead husband at Christmas isn't mocking a superstition, but her grief and her need to imagine that love doesn't die. Mockery here isn't proof of intellectual superiority, but a lack of empathy, the empathy that makes us human in the moral sense. Moreover, mocking these rituals opens the door to a culture of ridiculing difference in general. What stops us then from mocking mourning customs in other cultures or prayer rituals in different religions? Isn't mutual respect what keeps society from turning into a stage for arrogance and contempt? Wisdom lies in understanding that people cope with existential tragedy in different ways, and those ways, even if they seem illogical to us, may be vital for their emotional and moral survival. Finally, there's an undeniable beauty in these rituals. Humans are aesthetic beings before they're purely rational ones. Rituals, even those that seem irrational, carry a kind of poetry, an attempt to translate the invisible into something tangible and turn chaos into temporary order. When we offer food to the dead, we create an existential artwork, a silent painting that says, "You're gone, but you're here." This is, in itself, an act of resistance against nothingness, against the idea that the dead vanish forever. So, mocking these practices isn't just a moral mistake, it's also a failure of vision. It means being unable to see that humans don't live by logic alone, but by the myths they weave to face the darkness of existence. Perhaps the wiser choice is to look at these rituals with humility, knowing that in our moments of weakness and grief, we might turn to anything that offers even a speck of comfort. In the end, a human isn't just a mind that calculates, but also a heart that aches and a soul searching for meaning in a world that may have none. In medieval Europe, rituals of feeding the dead were common in many areas, though their forms and the church's acceptance of them varied. While Christianity tried to erase some pagan practices, old traditions blended with new beliefs, creating a mix of rituals that persisted among the common people. In England, placing food on graves was widespread, especially in rural areas. During All Hallows' Eve, which later became Halloween, people left bread and sweets called soul cakes outside homes or on graves as offerings for the dead, believing it brought them peace in the afterlife. Funeral feasts, known as like wakes, were held after burials, where neighbors were invited to eat and drink in honor of the dead, thinking their spirit joined them. In Germany, rituals called Totenspeise, food for the dead, were common, with dishes of soup and bread placed on graves, especially on days like Totensonntag, Sunday of the Dead. The belief was that hungry spirits, especially those without proper burials, might return to disturb the living if offerings weren't made. These practices were tied to ghost stories and supernatural beings like the Weissefrau, White Lady, thought to appear to draw attention to neglected graves. In Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Denmark, Viking traditions of offering food to ancestors continued even after adopting Christianity. In remote areas, farmers left beer and pork on burial mounds during midwinter, believing ancestors joined the feast to ensure a good harvest. Stories of the Draugr, spirits of the dead who returned from graves if offerings were neglected, reflect the fear of ignoring these rituals. In eastern Slavonia, areas like Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, rituals called Dziady, forefathers, were held in spring and fall. The living gathered at cemeteries to offer meals of honey, eggs, and pancakes, inviting the dead to join. It was believed spirits visited the earth on these days, and feeding them brought blessings and prevented their anger. Though the Orthodox Church fought these customs, they continued secretly among peasants. In Ireland and Scotland, traditions of Samhain remained strong. People left milk and potatoes on doorsteps or at ancient crosses to feed wandering spirits. Feasts of the dead, Fair Clan, were held in homes with an empty chair and plate of food left for the deceased, symbolizing their unseen presence. Indeed, the practice of feeding the dead wasn't unique to Europe, but spread across different cultures worldwide, each with its own beliefs and rituals. In ancient Egypt, food offerings were central to religious life. The living left bread, beer, and fruits in tombs for the deceased to use in the afterlife, as pyramid texts stated the soul, Ka, needed food to live in the fields of Yaru. In China, ancestor worship was closely tied to food offerings. Dishes of rice, fruits, and pork were placed on family altars during festivals like Qingming, Tomb Sweeping Day, with paper money burned for the dead to use in the underworld. Even today, some families leave a full dinner overnight for ancestors during the Hungry Ghost Festival, Zhongyuan Jie. In India, the Hindu ritual Shraddha involves offering meals of flatbreads and sweets to priests on behalf of the dead, believing ancestors receive them in Pitraloka, the realm of the dead. In some areas, food is also left for crows, seen as messengers of the dead. In Africa, among groups like the Yoruba in Nigeria, rice and meat are offered at funerals of important figures to satisfy them on their journey to the spirit world. In Madagascar, the Famadihana, turning of the bones, ritual involves removing ancestors' remains from graves, offering festive meals, and reburying them. Even in pre-Columbian America, the Aztecs and Maya had food offering rituals, presenting corn, beans, and even human sacrificial blood to please gods and the dead. In ancient Peru, mummies of ancestors were seated at feast tables during festivals, offered dishes of corn and potatoes. These similar practices, despite geographic distance, show that feeding the dead is a universal human response to the fear of death and the desire to stay connected with those who have passed. In many parts of the world, people still hold on to ancient customs linking them to those who have left this world. In remote villages and old cities, generations pass down strange rituals, blending emotions with beliefs, where food is offered not to the living, but to the dead. These practices, which some find odd, are truly a bridge between two worlds, a human attempt to comfort loss and keep memories alive. Visiting cemeteries in rural Greece, you might stumble upon a curious scene. Plates of traditional sweets are carefully placed on stone gravestones, with small cups of local wine. Elders maintain this custom regularly, especially on certain days of the year. They believe their loved ones' spirits visit these places and need something to ease their hunger on their journey between worlds. The scent of cinnamon and sesame fills the air as women whisper ancient prayers. On long winter nights in some Irish villages, you may notice a strange habit among certain families. They leave an empty seat at the dinner table with a full plate, spoon, and cup. When asked why, they smile sadly and say it's for a guest who might visit. This guest is an ancestor who may wish to share the family meal. In the morning, they check the plate to see if the food has lessened, a sign the spirit joined their meal. In Mexico, the scene of feeding the dead turns into a colorful celebration during the Day of the Dead. Full tables are set up in homes and streets, decorated with orange flowers and candles. Plates of sweet bread of the dead, the deceased's favorite fruits, and even cigarettes or bottles for those who smoked or drank. Families sit around the table, laughing and recalling stories of those who passed, believing their spirits attend the celebration and enjoy the food somehow. In Southeast Asia, these rituals take a more complex form. During China's Hungry Ghost Festival, streets turn into giant feasting tables. Lavish food is offered on temporary stoves, with fake money and miniature models of cars and houses burned. The belief is that hungry spirits with no one to care for them emerge from the underworld at this time. Feeding and calming them prevents harm to the living. Among certain tribes in Madagascar, strange celebrations occur every few years. They remove ancestors' remains from graves, wrap them in new cloth, and hold a grand feast. Everyone dances and sings around the mummified bodies, offering the best dishes as if the dead will eat. Children play among the decayed grandparents, in a scene mixing fear with innocence, death with life. These strange customs vary in form, but share the same essence. They all express a deep human need to cope with the idea of death, control fear of it, and keep memories alive. Food here isn't just nourishment, but a language of connection with another world, an attempt to bridge the gap between present and past, the living and the dead. In the end, these rituals tell us that the dead may leave our sight, but they remain in our hearts and memories, and in some cultures, even at our dining tables,